Welcome everybody to this edition of Khouri Conversations, the COVID Zoom version. And once more in partnership with JSpaceCanada, my name is Raja Khouri, and welcome all to this 1-hour webinar with our featured guest, Peter Biro. As you know, the Khouri Conversations are conversations and not debates. We're not here to prove someone wrong or someone right. We're here to deepen understanding of important issues. As you also know, we always deal with light topics and that have simple solutions to them. And today is no different. The title of our session today is Constitutional Democracy Under Stress, Canada, the World, and Israel-Palestine. Now, the format we will follow is our guest, Peter Biro, will give a brief presentation on the book he edited, which has the same title, except that the second line in it is it's called Constitutional Democracy Under Stress, A Time for Heroic Citizenship. That's the title of the book that he edited. And Karen Mock today is wearing two hats. Of course, she's the president of JSpace, but she's also a contributor to the book and author of one of its chapters. So Peter will start us off with his presentation. And following that, Karen will speak about her chapter, and then we will have a conversation about all of it and open the door for Q&A. For those of you who are not familiar with Zoom, there is at the bottom of your screen a button that you can click on that says Q&A, and that's where you can put your questions. So I'll start with introducing Peter and Karen. Peter is a lawyer, founder of Section1.ca, chair emeritus of the Jane Goodall Institute Global, and CEO of Neocon Aptic. He has published and lectured widely on legal and political affairs and been an outspoken advocate for social liberties, human rights, civics education, wildlife conservation, and animal welfare. He is chair of the advisory board of AVAIL, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and a past governor of the University of Haifa. He is editor of Constitutional Democracy Under Stress, A Time for Heroic Citizenship by the Mosaic Press, as you mentioned earlier. Karen Mock is, of course, president of JSpaceCanada. She's also an acclaimed human rights advocate, consultant, psychologist, and educator. She is former executive director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada. She was the founder of the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue Group and the Enhancing Social Justice Educational Group, among many other things. She has been qualified by the Canadian courts and tribunals as an expert on human rights, racism, anti-Semitism, and hate crime. She was granted the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal and recently inducted into the Order of Canada. So welcome both of you. The topic again is constitutional democracy under stress. We've seen in recent weeks many demonstrations of these stresses. We've seen the President of the United States refusing to commit to a peaceful transition of government in case he loses. We heard him in the debate 2 days ago refuse to denounce white supremacy. We've seen Brexit. We've seen even the government of the UK recently introduced legislation that breaks international law. This is the country of the rule of law, introducing legislation that goes against international law. Things have changed in recent years. We have in a number of countries these populist, illiberal governments take hold, such as in the Philippines, Hungary, Poland, Israel, Brazil, Italy, of course, the United States and Turkey. We've seen the right wing rising in places like France and Germany. But you're not here to hear me talk about this. We're here to hear Peter, who actually knows what he's talking about, to explain to us what is going on. Why did he decide to pursue writing this, editing this book and bring all these experts together? And what are the main themes and outcomes of this effort? So Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Raja. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be with you and to participate in this conversation with you. I've been an admirer of yours for many, many years. And of course, I'm so delighted to be doing this with Karen. We've collaborated on a number of things now over the years, and very honored to be also part of the JSpace community, which of course is also my community. And thrilled to be with all of our viewers and listeners out there from across the spectrum in our community. Raja, you really summarized sort of the context in which this conversation takes place, but let me sort of put my spin on it. To borrow from Bobby Zimmerman, otherwise known as Bob Dylan, repurposing one of his lines, "It's not dark yet, but it's getting there." I don't think it's catastrophizing too much to say that we are now living in a dark age. And as one of my heroes and contributors to this book, by the way, Jane Goodall, says, there's still reason for hope. But I think we're at a point in time where we have to be realistic and say that there's genuine reason for concern, to the point where we have to do more than observe and comment. We need to respond. We need to act. We have now witnessed, as Raja has sort of already briefly sort of summarized, what has now been widely acknowledged throughout Western democracies around the world as a retreat from the norms and conventions that we had come to accept as being the conventional positions for what we in the West, in any event, always thought to be a civil, indeed civilized civil society. We've seen the retreat from adherence to conventions and practices and rules and principles on behalf of populist leaders, some of whom began life as reformers, people like Erdogan in Turkey and Orban in Hungary, who actually were elected as liberal reformers, and then in very, very short order turned around and took control, turned their societies from what were thought to be liberal democracies into, and proudly so in the case of Orban, illiberal democracies, and even worse. The marketplace of ideas that is critical to the functioning of any healthy democracy is in bad shape everywhere, even in our own country. And I look forward to a conversation with you about that in the course of the next hour. The marketplace of ideas, which depends on the shared deference to the authority of truth, of knowledge, of facts, on a societal level, is tearing apart at the seams, and that makes it impossible for us to generate the kind of consensus that is necessary in society across partisan lines, across ideological lines, across cultural and socioeconomic lines, to address the really major challenges that we're confronting. And it's led to what I refer to as a social cohesion deficit in our societies. It's not enough for us to conform to certain codes of conduct. You need, in order to address the kinds of challenges we're facing in the COVID-19 pandemic, in climate change, and of course in the rampant, exponentially increasing economic inequality, you need a kind of societal commitment to be sort of on the same page, even if you disagree on the strategies. And you can only be on the same page when you accept the facts and when you respect the truth seekers. Social media as we all know, and we're actually doing this in a way through the facility of social media and the internet. Social media, by its nature and structure, creating this kind of culture of echo chambers, is really amplifying the problem by creating a structural barrier to consensus generation across all these ideological and partisan lines, and really amplifying the kind of polarization that we're experiencing in society. Economic inequality, which I've already mentioned, increasing at an exponential rate, not just in terms of the income gap, which is measured by the Gini coefficient between the wealthy and the not wealthy, but much more significantly in the tremendous disparity of wealth. That is, in the wealth gap between the, people always refer to the top 1% and the rest. Well, we're now talking about the top 0.1% that ultimately control the lion's share of the economy. That has had a tremendously destabilizing effect on not just liberal democracies, on China as well. The only difference is that China and other societies, of course, but the difference between democracies and autocracies, dictatorships, and other forms of authoritarian government is that they can respond with a different set of tools when they are met with resistance or instability. Not tools that we respect or like in our society, but it makes it a lot easier for them to control societies when that kind of instability, when there's that kind of disenchantment. In the case of inequality, it's obvious that people rise up because their welfare is deeply affected. In liberal democracies, if you want to address the issue, you're going to have to do it in a way that that attracts or commands rather the allegiance of the population. That's very, very hard if you haven't offered a concrete solution to the problem of inequality. Partisan politics become more deeply polarized than ever as a function of many things. Identity politics, again, this breakdown of what I call the shared epistemic foundation or the marketplace of ideas. People now identify in a partisan way, in ways that we would now understand as being ideologically incoherent. That is to say that your partisan affiliation, and I'm not just talking about the United States, is going to be determined more as a function of what group you belong to than as a function of the ideas to which you're committed, or the process of reasoning and responding to facts as you become aware of them. This presents a tremendous problem for consensus generation and for any sort of communal engagement across partisan lines. Let me just say before we move into the conversation, Raja, if I might, and I hope no one's offended by this, just a quick remedial run through the essential elements, constituent elements of what we call a liberal constitutional democracy, so that when we proceed with the conversation later, we'll understand what kinds of values and institutions are on the line here. So in all cases, liberal democracies share certain features. They have a democratic electoral system that, where with periodic elections, free and fair, that have to be meaningful. In other words, there has to be a possibility that anyone could win this election. They can't be stacked. They can't be rigged, as the current occupant of the White House likes to put it. They have to guarantee basic rights and freedoms, basic civil liberties of expression, especially, and assembly, and a whole host of others, religion, conscience, etc. They have to adhere to the rule of law. That means not merely respecting the independence of the judiciary, but also understanding that the entire apparatus of government operates as a rule-making, rule-abiding, rule enforcement system, and a fair one, an independent and impartial one. And in the post-war period, by which I mean the post-Second World War period, there's a new element that is really, figures prominently now in the decline of liberal democracy, and that is the bag of social welfare promises and prosperity promises and distributive justice promises that were made by, in the post-New Deal period in the United States and in the post-social welfare period here in Canada and in Britain and indeed throughout continental Europe. the promise that inequality will be permissible only to the extent that the least well-off among us are provided for and benefit from the increased inequality. Well, that's not happening anymore. Liberal democracies also are committed to having leaders who tolerate each other and who tolerate their opponents. Not to be too corny, but to borrow from another musical idol or favorite of mine, Joe Bonamassa, just because you can, don't mean you should. When you've got power, the point of leadership in a liberal democracy is you don't exercise it arbitrarily or just because you have it, the way some people south of the border think you do. In a liberal democracy, you exercise it responsibly and in a measured way. That is a critical dimension of political leadership in a liberal democracy. Now, there are a whole host of other features. I don't want to take up time going into it, but what I will say is that we can recognize, and Raja at the outset identified a number of events and factors and developments that simply point to this, that the move away from regard for and defense of these institutions and the cardinal values that underlie them, such as, for example, the equality principle or the principle of political pluralism, and I know that Karen will have something to say about that. When we depart from that, everything starts to fall apart and it gets very, very dangerous. And I just want to say this, democracy, especially liberal democracy, is neither inevitable nor, as I've said elsewhere, immortal. Democracies do die. And in fact, they have been dying around us. And that includes Israel, which I know we're going to come to look at now. I don't want to be alarmist, particularly because I love Israel. I love the idea of Israel, but Israel's very, very complex. I love the idea of a just Israel, of a secure Israel, but one that lives in harmony and in a respectful way with its Arab neighbors, and in particular with the Palestinians, both in terms of its foreign relations, but also in terms of its domestic societal arrangements. So what I'll say, and I don't think, this is, I think this is a view that's widely shared, certainly by the people on this panel, that, Israel, like other liberal democracies, although it's always been unique in certain respects, and we'll talk about that, has moved quite dramatically and markedly in the direction of illiberalism. And this is a tremendous problem. And it's done so for some of the reasons that are common to all of the other liberal democracies and some of the reasons I've identified, but it also has some unique aspects to it. So with that, let me just stop and pause and turn it back over to Raja.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yes, you're right. We will be coming back to the topic of Israel specifically. Just one question. Historically, the working class, so to speak, were protected and represented by the left.
Yes.
Today we see them more represented and spoken about by the right, as we've seen with Donald Trump. We also saw with the new leader of the Conservative Party here speaking to that group of or that segment of society. What are your thoughts on that?
So what you've just said is a perfect and wonderful example, excellent example of what I was talking about earlier. Our current condition of what I call ideological incoherence, or what others such as Ezra Klein, for example, have referred to as identity politics or identification politics. That is to say that now you've specifically talked about the working class. Well, the working class are the most disenchanted, sector of society for all the reasons that we understand. And going back to my comments about exponentially increasing economic inequality, as well as others. I mean, the working class has been excluded from a meaningful participation in the knowledge economy, except only as commodities in the knowledge economy, but not as beneficiaries of it. So what I would say is, especially white working class people have become, their understandable resentment, bitterness, frustration, and disappointment has been weaponized by populist leaders like Donald Trump, but not just like Donald Trump, by other populist leaders, and for good and understandable reasons in many cases, because what he and other populists on the right have done is recognize that the liberals, the traditional home of the working class and of labor, it really dropped the ball over the last number of decades, became, and I think it's fair to say, elitist and overly preoccupied, and I'll be interested in Karen's take on this, overly preoccupied with the advancement of the human rights agenda for all of the good reasons that I think we will all agree on, but also for some not so great reasons, or to put it differently, in not so constructive ways that have backfired, and in fact have alienated a lot of people who don't intellectually relate or identify with that entire enterprise. It's more complex than that, Raja, but what I'll say is your example is an excellent one. And to sum it up, I'd say that's a perfect example of the ideological incoherence and the kind of ideological realignment that's taking place, or the partisan realignment that's taking place.
Well, that's a good segue into Karen's talk. Karen, the title of the chapter that you wrote is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in a Pluralistic Society, Core Canadian Values to Counter Xenophobia and Hate. Now, we know that Canada is not anything doesn't look anything like the United States today. We also know that we are not an island, and we live in the same world that where these things are happening. But looking at what happened in the last federal election, we saw Maxime Bernier's The People's Party not making any grounds. It was a populist sort of right-wing party that questioned things like multiculturalism, said we had excessive multiculturalism here, whatever that means. They didn't get it for. I mean, he didn't even secure his own seat. I'm talking about Maxime Bernier. So, are we actually safer? How are we doing in terms of what comes usually with these, right-wing movements is white supremacy, racism of various kinds, and divisions between groups?
In a word, no, we're not doing much better. We may be more polite about it, and there may be ways that it looks as if we're doing much better, but we were, and we are, at risk, and our liberal democracy is fragile. However, on the other hand, and there is another hand, yes, thanks for activism and people who spoke up, and the humiliation and embarrassment that we're able to cause when some of our political leaders and candidates refuse to denounce white supremacy, and when they use anti-immigration tactics, there's enough of a disconnect, and there are enough other parties that are more reputable in this regard that we have so far been able to not have those kinds of parties really take a foothold. And when we really are able to expose it, yes, some of the parties will expel candidates who are actually exposed as being known white supremacists or hanging out with skinheads or whatever. Sadly, though, they go through some of the motions. And Peter, I have to say that maybe I might have said we're living in a white age, not a dark age, because we're still. And you know that tendency of wanting to have dark or black associated with something evil. Yes, we had something called the Dark Ages, but let us remember that in white-dominated societies, even though many white people, and we're speaking frankly, we try at JSpace to create a safe space where we can have these conversations. Many people who are members of minorities other than people of color, who are the minority in terms of power in a white-dominated society, but I'm talking about other victimized groups, fail to acknowledge and accept the concept of white privilege. So the concepts you were alluding to and why we are so much at risk and why what's happened in the States is happening is that it's well known historically that during difficult economic times and or when people are wanting to gain power, they will often target minority groups, religious minority groups, people of color, immigrants, and you get that rhetoric, and Goebbels taught us all very well. You repeat the lies, you repeat the half-truths, you repeat the stereotypes, you repeat the mantras over and over until people actually believe them. And if someone's looking for someone to scapegoat for their problems, what better than the immigrant groups or people who feel, you mentioned rightly so, they feel somehow threatened or somehow, well, they are threatened because when people have had power and someone wants to equalize the society or implement programs of equity and human rights so that everyone can be equally privileged and have full access to our society and everything it offers, that's when people feel very threatened. And it's very easy, as again we were taught in 1933, to exploit democracy at its weakest link, and then when someone gains power, to eliminate democracy. And in Canada today, just as worldwide, and in the States in particular, but again, in Canada, incidents of hate crime are on the rise. Attacks on Jews, attacks on Muslims, attacks on immigrants, and tragically, of course, the anti-Black racism, which is alive and palpable, and tensions get put up. And, you know, we have to also acknowledge, as you do, and I know you do, and all of us do, that the Aboriginal people, the Indigenous people, and anti-Indigenous oppression continues. So on the one hand, we're doing better, but we can do better. And even our democracy is at risk, as you have so nobly shown us by this amazing project, Section 1, on Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I mean, look at that. In 1982, when that charter was drafted, it entrenched equality rights and multiculturalism in the Constitution among our core Canadian values. And the charter guarantees equal protection and benefit of the law, free from discrimination on the basis of race, national or ethnic origin, color, and religion. So the 80s were a time of revolution in that regard. Raja and I were talking about the chapter. It goes into all the history of our policies and our theories. And I think those on the audience who know me know that I guess I've spent my life devoting myself to how do you actually implement in practice the theories and the policies. Because when the subtitle, Core Canadian Values to Counter Xenophobia and Hate, that was actually Peter's subtitle to my topic. And I started my talk at his wonderful conference, which, by the way, Peter, I am so honored to have been included in your conference and your book. But I started my talk and my chapter by saying the main message of the chapter is that, and I know you're not supposed to quote yourself, but I'm going to quote myself. The main message is that it's only actions based on our values that can counter the effects of prejudice and xenophobia. And I'm sorry, the values aren't going to do it. The bad news is the values can't just do it. And people pass the buck. The police and law enforcement will blame education, and education will blame someone else. And instead of recognizing that in order to maintain the safety that many of us feel that should be extended to every one of Canadians, we need protection of the law and knowing who to turn to and know that everyone does have protection of the law. We need protection. We need prevention, which is education, at every single level of the system, every level, so that nobody says, oh, you know, there's no such thing as systemic discrimination, everybody's equal, and so on. So at every level. And thirdly, it's partnerships, not just allies, but allies who are willing to take action. And so now today, for example, allies who are activists with Black Lives Matter, allies who are activists countering anti-Semitic hate crime, allies who are activists countering Islamophobia and all of the phobias and all of the isms together. That's where we stand.
Karen, yeah, thank you, Karen. And you're right. I remember after 9/11, and I was at the Canadian Arab Federation at the time, the backlash against Arabs and Muslims and the conversations that we had with each other about, you know, what is the value of this charter if it's not protecting us right now from being racially profiled. And so you're right. Values are not enough, and even legislation is not enough. I mean, it has to be implemented correctly.
Yeah, if I might just add one thing too, and I know we're going to continue the conversation, which I find so exciting. But actually, that's when we first met, and I can't believe that it's almost 20 years ago. And then fast forward, when we were on the hate crimes community working group together, what did I do as chair? I asked all the community members who were on that panel, and we had representatives from diverse groups, Aboriginal groups, Black groups, you name it, Muslim groups. It was all in, there were only 9 of us, but we represented the cross-section. Raja was on that committee. And I asked everyone to bring in all the reports that they were aware of and that their community had contributed to. And they came on both sides of me this high on the floor. Do you remember that? And I think some of the bureaucrats who were in the Attorney General's Department and the Ministry of Safety and Corrections were shocked. We've had communities contributing so much to tell their stories, to raise their voices, and then they're silenced on the shelves in reports. But we're still at it.
Thank you, Karen. Before we go to Q&A, there is one more aspect of the conversation, and that is about Israel. Of course, issues of Israel-Palestine matter to us a lot in these webinars. And Peter, you started talking about Israel. You know, we've seen the Netanyahu government do things that were clearly illiberal, from legislation such as the nation-state law to the silencing of dissent and so on. I'm sure you'll tell us about that. Now, before we start, those of you who want to ask questions, please go to the Q&A. If you don't want your name mentioned, say that it should be anonymous, otherwise I will identify the questioner. Please go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Raja. And I will try to be brief here so that we really do have an opportunity for questions. Look, I think it is almost trite at this point to say that Israel has moved in the last couple of decades, especially the last decade, from being a genuinely pluralistic democracy to one of unconstrained majoritarian rule. And by the way, a majority that has moved markedly to the right. And I think it's fair also to say that Israel's slide into illiberalism has to be understood as part of an attempt or a strategy at establishing a political and legal foundation for annexation, permanent or otherwise. I just think we have to call that for what it is. To disagree with that, and I'm not saying there aren't other views, but I think that for purposes of this conversation, I'm going to take that as an established position. Now, Israel has historically had an ethno-nationalist identity, and it's always been in direct tension with a kind of utopian, universalist, liberal democratic identity. I think of that tension as being what I call a kind of noble tension. That is to say, the particularistic nationalism of Israel that always had to be understood in distinction to or from all other kinds of nationalism, particularly as it was established in the post-war period when the word nationalism was associated with, obviously, the Third Reich. It's difficult not to associate it with that. So when we use the term nationalism for Israel, we talk about particularistic nationalism that has something to do with the Jewish homeland, but always struggled with the question of what Jewish self-government would really mean and how it could be a just self-government, be true to the aspiration for nationhood, and at the same time be just in all the ways that Jews as a diaspora period throughout the ages, diaspora people throughout the ages, appreciated and respected, because as a diaspora people in the minority, a persecuted minority, they always appreciated the importance of pluralism, even in its absence, perhaps especially in its absence. Now, Karen referred to Section 1 of the Charter, 1982. Well, 10 years later, Israel got its version of Section 1 of the Charter, and I might add, it very much influenced by the actual Section 1 in the Canadian Charter. People like Irwin Cotler and others actually consulted with the drafters of Israel's Basic Law in 1992, the Human Dignity and Liberty Law, which is one of the basic laws, and it has a quasi-constitutional status. Most people understand that Israel does not have a written constitution, but it has actually quite a rich constitutional jurisprudence, and the basic laws are treated as being special and having a very distinct and more significant enduring value. Well, that basic law of 1992 embodies the principles of pluralism. It embodies the principles in the Charter. It is civil libertarian. And not only that, it doesn't just protect the rights and freedoms of all Israeli residents and citizens, but it also, as with Section 1, contains a formula. It's for justifying limitations of those rights and freedoms on conditions that are fair and just, and that would not be found to be violations of the broader commitment to pluralism and justice. Very, very interesting. Sadly, of course, almost 2 decades later, and precisely 70 years after the founding of the state, we get the nation state basic law, also the status of a basic law, the nation state law in 2018, that effectively takes Israel from being a pluralist society officially, one that not only respects but protects and gives equal civic status to the Druze and the Bedouins and the Arabs and the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews, even though it is still a Jewish homeland and still a Jewish state. It goes from that kind of a pluralist state to being a state or government of all the people, for the Jews and by the Jews. And that may be actually a bit nasty and a bit overstating the point, and I should maybe reconsider that formulation. But I think, in fairness, we have to recognize that the nation-state law takes Arabic and relegates it to a second-class language, not to the official language status. It takes non-Jews and relegates them to a different civic status. When that happens, and this is, of course, happening in the wake of certain other developments. Let me just cite a few of those examples, and then we can go to questions. All right?
Excuse me, Peter, just on that last point. You probably would agree that the Palestinian citizens of Israel always experienced a second-class citizenship status.
That's not a controversial statement at all, of course. When I called Israel a pluralist society from its inception, by no means am I whitewashing the Palestinian understanding of its own history, the Nakba, the disenfranchisement, and the occupation itself as well. I mean, so yes, the short answer is, of course, yes, I acknowledge what you're saying.
Yeah, but then Netanyahu took, steps further into the wrong direction. And I remember in a recent election, he went on TV saying to Israeli Jews, essentially, the Arabs are voting in droves. And that's, that's a typically populist, discriminatory, marginalizing type of, sorry, I interrupted you.
Let me just finish what I was saying, and of course I acknowledge that, and I took it so for granted that we all understand that being an Arab and being a Palestinian Arab in Israel throughout Israel's history has not been a picnic, but at the same time, I do think it's important to understand and acknowledge that the aspirations of the early Zionists, all right, and of the founders of the state, and in fact of the leaders of the state, was to establish a socially just, pluralistic state. And I believe they achieved that, but not in a perfect way by any means. Let me just identify a couple of low points that take us to the nation-state law so that we can see how things degenerated. We've got the boycott law, which defined calls for boycotts as being actually a civil offense. Now, one can understand from a security standpoint or from a national interest standpoint how that could be problematic and even threatening, that is, the calls for boycotts. But if liberal democracy is your religion, is the sort of the ideological framework under which you govern yourselves, you've got to allow for unpopular speech. You've got to allow for protest. You have to allow for fundamental objections to the way you're governing the state. In 2011, the admissions committee law that discriminated against Arabs wishing to live in certain small Jewish residential communities. The Nakba law, of course, in a little bit later, which essentially decreed that any public institution that actually observed the Nakba on Independence Day would be the commission of an offense. The NGO transparency law passed in 2016 that required NGOs, particularly foreign NGOs, to disclose all funding sources publicly. Again, and then there's, of course, the override bill, which is really, really problematic because that really constituted a major entrenchment on judicial independence, basically authorizing the Knesset to annul court rulings that it found to be unconstitutional. And those are just some examples, and this occurs along the way, and then of course you have the 2018 nation-state law. Well, what are the implications of all of this? In 1992, the year of the Human Dignity and Liberty Basic Law, the Palestinians and the Israelis under Rabin were negotiating at that very time the Oslo Accord that would be celebrated at the White House the very following year. It's not an accident that at that very moment, Israel's commitment to a two-state solution was obvious and really was seen not just in the mainstream, but pretty much everywhere, except on the fringes, as being the only right and just option in terms of addressing the Palestinian aspiration to self-government and statehood. We have now all but abandoned that. When I say we, I'm not talking present company accepted. I mean, the mainstream in Israel appears to have abandoned its commitment to the two-state solution. We're all familiar with Peter Beinart's piece that appeared in the New York Times some weeks ago, and he was a guest here. The argument, now being, for different reasons, that one state is likely going to be the only way to go. Peter's perspective, which is a very, very, very interesting one and has merit, even though I don't personally share it, has more to do with distinguishing between self-government and nation-state status versus, or as opposed, as distinct from homeland. The concept of homeland and self-government in a nation-state, two different concepts. But what's clear is the main players, Netanyahu, Trump, for all that he will remain a main player, and a great deal of mainstream Israeli society that has moved markedly to the right, is now taking the one-state approach more seriously, but with different facts on the ground, with increased settlements, with the move to annexation. I say that notwithstanding the recent provisional agreement in the context of the UAE-Bahrain so-called peace deal to put a moratorium on the annexation plan. But there's no question that's the direction. So that's the kind of background, that's the context in which we now find ourselves.
I have a question from Akash Maharaj, specifically on that last point, Peter, about the normalization agreements with the UAE and Bahrain, both of which are highly authoritarian states. On balance, do you see these agreements as a positive sign that Israel and its neighbors are establishing peaceful relations, or a negative sign that Israel is warming to alliances with illiberal governments?
Well, Akash, speaking to you directly, the answer is both. And I think we share the same perspective on it. Normalization is a good thing in the sense that any nation state wants to have civil and secure and peaceful relations with its neighbors, both of a commercial nature, of a diplomatic nature, of a cultural nature. But of course, it's not good news in the sense that you're getting into bed with very illiberal states. They're not even illiberal democracies. These are authoritarian states. Some of them monarchies, some of them dictatorships of a different order. That can't be a good thing culturally, and it doesn't enhance sort of Israel's, interest or motivation to reform or to reverse its own internal illiberalism. It can't possibly be good for the engagement that needs to take place with the Palestinians. But again, normalization in general is a good thing. Better to have relations than not to have them at all. And as we know, Israel has had commercial relations and backdoor relations with those countries for a great, long period of time. Better that it should be out in the open.
Do you think these relations, normal relations, and I think Sudan is coming on next. These countries are getting into these arrangements for their own interests.
And so is Israel.
And so is Israel. Now, in the Palestinian context, is it more helpful to the Palestinian cause, self-determination, independent freedom, independent state, for Arab countries surrounding it to have warmer relations with it, or I say the normal relations with it, as opposed to the boycott of the last 70 some years?
Candidly, I don't know the answer to that question. I think I could, as a lawyer, I think I could make a compelling argument both ways on it. I don't really know the correct answer to that question. I think we're going to have to see. The proof is going to be in the pudding one way or the other. Certainly if you look at this from a purely security standpoint, Israel needs help in the region to fend off the hostility originating in and controlled by Iran and to a degree Syria. So it's good to have Saudi Arabia on your side overtly and expressly in that situation. And I say Saudi Arabia because Bahrain wouldn't be in it without Saudi's consent. And we know that Saudi Arabia will be in it at some point soon, or we expect they will. The problem is, one day there is going to be another Arab Spring, hopefully a more successful one. Those regimes with whom or with which Israel has just normalized relations. I don't like to call it peace because no conflict was actually resolved by this agreement.
I mean, they were not at war, but yeah.
That's right. I mean, ultimately, the hegemonies that are in place right now won't be there, ultimately. So Israel's own commitment to liberal democratic values, or at least values with which those who oppose those other regimes, just as they did in Tahrir Square in Egypt, during the Arab Spring and elsewhere, are not going to find it terribly encouraging if Israel doesn't sort of take a moral position on the nature of the civic arrangements in these Arab states. But it's very difficult.
Interestingly, Israel was not warm to the Arab Spring because of not knowing what's going to be at the other end of it. But that's a different conversation. Karen, I think, wanted to jump in.
I'm going to jump in here because, yes, indeed, that's a different conversation. Because if we're talking about our concerns around the rise of populism and what that does when people are looking to people to blame for their problems, then we're going to have a conversation about that. But I do have to agree on the one hand, and again, I guess I'm doing a very, is it like a little stereotype on the one hand and on the other hand, but on the one hand, yes, efforts at normalization are important. Efforts that we do not have liberal democracy unless you also have the institutions for democracy and peace. And peace isn't just not war. Peace is actually having what you need in the infrastructure. I think Israel will have completely missed an opportunity, and so will their new recognized normalized relations in the Middle East if they don't engage with Palestinians also on all of this. People have often said Palestinians never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Well, the Arab world, which has voted as a bloc in many areas against Israel and, tried to marginalize and isolate Israel, as relations are being normalized, and let's face it, nation states normalize relations for their own self-interest and always have. But if they truly are going to be or continue to be a democracy, then the internal relations, the human and civil rights, the dignity for Palestinians has to be on the agenda. And Arab states can help with that. But in the context, if they're serious, and if they haven't just turned their backs on the whole situation and said, well, we think Palestinians are an issue, but getting more arms is a more important issue. So on the one hand and on the other hand, that it's been JSpace's position. We're not giving up on the two-state solution, but we need a safe place to have conversations about other really practical models that truly will implement anti-racism, anti-oppression, human rights initiatives, equity, social justice, and humanitarian principles of Canada, and apply that to Israel, its citizens, and its neighbors. So it will have to be another conversation, I believe. But we do want to ensure, and we were so close. They averted annexation, but thank goodness, because then democracy would simply not have occurred.
Yeah, well, annexation has been averted for now, and the theft of land continues despite there not being annexation. So, but that's a different conversation. Peter, I have an interesting question here from Jonathan Brookman saying, there is no liberal democracy in the Middle East. Are we trying to impose Western values on the region?
Well, okay, I'll take
democracy.
Yeah. I'll take. So it's a good question, and I want to say I agree, except in a qualified way. First of all, when I say there's no liberal democracy, there's a pretty rich tradition in Israel's short-time statehood of being committed to institutions that we would recognize as being classic liberal democratic institutions. Its system of parliamentary democracy, the independence of the judiciary, its constitutional court, its high Supreme Court, its freedom of the press, the fact that you'll get more dissent in a Haaretz in a day than you will in the Jewish community in this city on major issues. I was in Haifa for a time when I was involved with the University of Haifa, as was Karen. Haifa is a highly pluralistic city in all kinds of ways. Now, having said that, it as I said, it has slid into illiberalism, and I just I can't stress how disappointing that is for me. That doesn't mean it's not redeemable, and my hope is it will be redeemable, and that there will be a return.
I grew up in Lebanon, and Lebanon has and always been a democracy, with a lot of faults, but a democracy with freedom of expression and all kinds of shindigs. Turkey has been a democracy since I think the 70s. Tunisia recently became a democracy as the result of the Arab Spring, the only success story coming out of the Arab Spring. So the notion of, I think, democracy being a Western value is, I don't sort of subscribe to that as so much. I think any society can, become democratic. What do you have to say about that?
Well, look, there is a point in the question, is that a lot of the concepts we're talking about, they started with John Locke, all right? And then they moved through John Stuart Mill, and then they moved through to John Rawls. And, in a sense, the values that we're speaking about today are largely Western values. They originate, in Western philosophy, in Western political discourse. But that doesn't mean that anybody is trying to impose Western values on Israel. I think Israel is a clear example of a place that is developing its own kind of indigenous culture. But at the same time, as I said, I referred to the basic law of human dignity and liberty. My mentor and teacher and dear friend, who also, by the way, collaborated on this book and contributed, Erwin Kotler, our former justice minister and attorney general. I'd love to have him on this conversation. He was deeply engaged with the drafters and the people considering the introduction of that basic law in 1992. The founders of Israel, sort of the Western Europeans who were fleeing the Holocaust, either pre or post. Survivors, or they came from the West, but there are also Oriental Jews, and there are also indigenous members of that community, and of course the Palestinians, who and the other members and the other cultural and ethnic communities in Israel that contribute enormously to the political culture and the political discourse of that country. I don't think it's a question of imposing Western values. Remember, Israel is also a member of the community of nations. It's a member of the United Nations. Some people lament that fact, but the fact of the matter is, we're in a post-Western period in many respects. And I think the language of sort of West versus something else is no longer as germane or as helpful as a kind of heuristic device to sort of understand politics and political discourse at this time.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you. I have to cut you off. We're out of time. I'm going to ask to be continued, Peter. Wonderful conversation. I'm going to ask Karen to put her other hat on now as the president of JSpaceCanada, which is co-presenting this webinar with us today, for some closing remark.
Thank you so much, Raja. And I also, when I give acknowledgements, I want to also thank David Grosskine and Amira Hassan for their support technically through the running of the webinar and also the posters and so on that you've seen. Thank you so much. There have been a few questions that we were not able to get to, including how are we going to ensure that we've got partners and that if we're working towards a two-state solution, democracy in both states and countering some of the dictatorship and the fear that exists in the region. So there are lots of other ideas for further webinars. So you're going to get the usual survey that you get from JSpaceCanada and Khouri Conversations to tell us what other webinars you'd like to have. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you also, if you can, to, when you get that survey, to consider making a donation so that we can continue offering these outstanding speakers and guests. And Peter, you're in that category. I think that the book goes a long way in challenging some of our values, or at least challenging Canadians to say, if this is what you truly believe, then we need to do what we can to protect democracy. And how do we, without imposing values, our values on other states, ensure that the positive parts, the human rights, the humanitarian, other aspects of progressive thinking and humanitarian and human rights thinking is implemented elsewhere. So thank you so much, Peter. We're going to include the link when we send all of our participants the survey. Will include the link for Peter's book, and you'll be able to order that. Further webinars, we did say there would be some, so I want to alert you to November 9th, when with the Ontario Institute for Education, we're going to be doing another Enhancing Social Justice Education webinar. And on the 19th and 20th, we'll be hosting Ken Stern, who has written The Conflict Over the Conflict, and we'll be partnering again with Khouri Conversations on that for a discussion of the conflict over the conflict on campus, and also on the IRA definition, is it inclusive or divisive? So much to continue. Thank you again, Raja. Thank you, Peter. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We promise we'll get back to you, and we hope to see you again. Stay safe and stay well wherever you are.
Thank you both. It's been an honor to be with you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.